Hello, I'm David. Raise your hand if you can't hear me. Perfect, okay. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm David Trilling. I'm trying to stand in the right place where you can see me and hear me, and also I don't make the shadows on the screen. Okay, maybe I'll stand here. So I'm a professor of astronomy at NAU. This is my 17th year here at NAU. And I've been the chair of the astronomy department also for 4 or 5 years or something. And it's fun to be here. I love the Festival of Science. Thanks everyone for coming on Friday night to hear about how Northern Arizona explores the solar system. First, I'll start by thanking our Festival of Science sponsors, of whom there are many here, of course. They make this whole thing happen, and so make sure you say thank you to all the sponsors, everybody here, and also thank you to Greg, who just disappeared. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Greg, for hosting us tonight, both in your Festival of Science role and your USGS role, and making this super easy for me. Thank you, appreciate it. Okay, so I'm going to talk for about a half hour tonight about how Northern Arizona explores the solar system, and I'm just going to set the stage here. And then I'll explain each of these things as we go through my story. Of course, in the upper left, this is a map of Arizona. Flagstaff is the blue dot. You are there. And the middle and the right panels are maps of the solar system. And I'll explain that to you in just a moment. But in case you're wondering, that pink square in the middle, the Earth is right in the middle of that. And you are on the Earth right now. So that's what that arrow means. And what I'm going to do tonight is just tell some stories about how scientists in Northern Arizona are exploring the solar system. And I'll start by apologizing for omissions. If I tried to tell every story of everything we're doing in Northern Arizona to explore the solar system, you would be here until next year's Festival of Science. So I just picked some vignettes and some nice pictures, but there's lots and lots more that I won't tell you about tonight. Come back for the open house on Sunday. You'll hear a ton more and learn a ton more here at USGS. And all the rest of the Festival of Science stuff that's going on. Okay, I'm going to start with a map of the solar system. And so this figure that I'm showing here, the sun is this big glowy thing on the left, and then those are the planets labeled Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. You might wonder if there's a planet missing down at the end of that list. I'll come back to that in a moment. So this picture, this is not a scale diagram of the solar system, but each of those planets is shown to scale and to the scale of the sun. Okay, so the sun is really big. The next biggest thing is Jupiter. The next biggest thing is Saturn, and so on. So that's how the solar system sort of looks. You can have a mental map. And I have this banner on the left side, and I'll keep showing that over and over again in the talk to help you keep oriented. And again, the inner solar system is at the top here. It's the sun. And then all the way down to the bottom, there's that missing planet called Pluto. And that's the order that we'll talk about these things tonight. I want to emphasize here that in the solar system, those planets, they're all shown in a line like that. In our solar system, the planets are actually more or less in a flat plane, like a disk or a dish or a frisbee or something like that. And so the next picture I'm going to show you is looking down on top onto that, from the top down into the solar system. And when I show you this picture here, the one on the left is the inner solar system. The one on the right is the outer solar system. So again, this is looking down onto the solar system. I guess I can just walk over. There's the sun, the big yellow thing in the middle. And the planets are labeled here: Mercury, Venus, Earth, that's where you are, Mars. And then this whole thing fits in that square: Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. This is not just a diagram. This is actually a map of our solar system as of a couple days ago, the positions of everything in our solar system that we know about. And when you look at this picture, what you see is whatever, 9-ish planets, and then a million, literally a million of these blue dots. And these are asteroids. Most of the mass in our solar system is in the sun. Most of the rest of the mass is in Jupiter and then Saturn. But most of the things in our solar system are asteroids. And you can see that in this map of all these blue things all over the place. So as we walk through, we'll talk about the planets, but I'll also stop and talk about the asteroids, my favorite, and then we'll continue to talk about some more planets. Okay, so there's your orientation. And now we're going to start walking down this banner, as I showed you on the left, from the sun. And I'll highlight these things in purple as we go down so you can keep track of where we're going. First, we're going to talk about the sun. So this thing at the bottom is the Lowell Discovery Telescope, which is off Lake Mary Road, about an hour, that way. It's the telescope owned by Lowell Observatory. The primary mirror is about just over 4 meters across. And like most telescopes, we usually use it at night when it's dark and the sun is not up. This slide, I'm going to tell you about the sun. So this guy named Joe Lama at Lowell Observatory had an extremely clever idea, which is he realized that during the day, nobody's using this telescope. And in particular, nobody's using this very high precision instrument that sits in the basement of this telescope. If we could find a way to connect that instrument to look at the sun, then we could use the telescope 24 hours a day, and we could use that instrument and get some amazing data. So he bought these 2 little cameras that are up. Oh, I can use my pointer. Look at that. These 2 little cameras that sit up at the top. And you don't want to point a 4-meter telescope at the sun because you'll catch the whole thing on fire. But if you have a telescope that's about that big, that's how big the entrance window for those telescopes are, less than an inch. You can point that thing at the sun. You can send the data down a fiber optic cable all the way into the bottom of this telescope, and then you can make very high precision measurements of the sun. Great. Why would you want to do that if you're a nighttime astronomer? Well, the sun happens to be the star that is closest to the Earth. It's the star that we know the best. And if we want to know more about our star, we can study our star. If we want to know about other stars, maybe we should start by learning as much as we can about our own star first. And the final thing is that around other stars in the galaxy, we know there are planets that orbit those other stars. It turns out that the limit to our knowledge about those planets is actually how well we know the star. So if we can learn more about our sun, we can learn more about those other stars, then we can learn more about those other planets. So this is what this telescope is doing during the day. This thing is closed, so the sunlight doesn't get in. The sunlight comes in and into the bottom of this telescope to learn about our sun. Okay, moving on. We started at the sun. We're going to move our way from inward to outward in the solar system. So the next thing, I put together Mercury and Venus, because Mercury and Venus are very hard to study. And I don't have a lot to say about Mercury and Venus right now. They're hard to study because they're between the Earth and the sun. So if you look at this, here we go. There's the Earth, there's the sun. Mercury and Venus are in between us and the sun, which means if you want to look at Mercury, you're pretty much looking at the sun. That's very painful. It's hard to put telescopes to look at the sun, and it's hard to put spacecraft to go look towards Mercury and Venus as well. So we don't have any current missions, or even really any near future missions to either Mercury or Venus. I'm going to skip right over that. And let's talk about the Earth, or really the Earth-Moon system. I put them together here. So as a reminder, the Earth is inside the pink square. You are there. And it turns out that the Earth is an interesting place. And you might want to study things on the Earth because you're interested in the Earth. Okay, I'm not interested in the Earth, I'm an astronomer, but we still could study lots of places on Earth that are analogs for other places in the solar system. So here are some examples I want to show you. I'm going to start in the top right. So J.F. Smekens from NAU is a volcanologist, and he studies volcanoes. And this is a place that he went this summer in Italy. This is an active volcano in Italy. And he built this little camera which can measure properties of the gases coming out of that volcano and some other stuff about how this volcano operates. Why would you want to do that? Well, you might want to learn about a volcano. If you live, for example, on the side of a volcano, which we do here in Flagstaff, you might want to know something about how volcanoes work. But also there are volcanoes elsewhere in the solar system. And I'll come back to that in a moment. If you want to know how those volcanoes might work, well, let's study some volcanoes here on Earth first so that we can learn more about those other volcanoes. Okay, here's another example. This is Ali Rutledge, who's an NAU professor, and Ian Mars, who's a PhD student. And they are on a glacier in northern Sweden. They did that this summer. And they're interested in understanding both how glaciers work on Earth, but also what could be the historical or the history of glacial presence on Mars. There's ice on Mars, there's water ice and also carbon dioxide ice. Those ices interact with rocks, and they have for the history of Mars, and they still are today. Well, we don't know a lot about exactly how that works. But if we can go study a glacier here, we can understand how those ices and rocks interact in certain climates or certain environments. Maybe we can learn something here on Earth that we could help us learn something about what's happening on Mars. Okay, here's another one. This is this one here. Sorry, I'll point out they're holding this NAU flag. It's a little bit hard to see, but we send people with flags all over the world. So they've got NAU flag in Sweden. This is in the Northwest Passage in northern Canada from a couple months ago. Christopher Edwards is this person, and this is Ari Capel, who is a former PhD student of ours. They went on this completely ridiculous cruise through the Northwest Passage, which was a research trip. And it's a little bit hard to see in this picture, but this is one of the places where they were able to go ashore in northern Canada. And there are these giant polygons on the surface here, which we actually see on other planets. And it's kind of mysterious how those giant polygons form. They're like the size, of this area. That's how big this polygon is on Mars. And they have something to do, the origin of these has something to do with the interaction of the water in the rock on Mars, or maybe the subsurface water and the ice. And we don't really totally understand, but maybe we can study it on Earth, and that might tell us something about how these formations exist, how and why they exist on Mars. Okay, two more. This is Haley Sapers, right here is an NAU professor. She's in black here and in blue over here. And she and her team they were in the far North Arctic this summer at like 85 degrees north latitude. Crazy. And I want to put that together with this person over here, who is Mark Salvatore from NAU, who was in Antarctica, this is a few years ago, at about 85 degrees south latitude. So we've sent people to both poles. And they're doing similar work here, which is to sample in the water. They're sampling microbial communities. And the question is, can life exist in these extreme conditions? What kind of life? How does it exist there? How well does it exist there? And then could life exist somewhere else in our solar system based on what we've learned in these two spots? And I'll come back to that in a minute as well. And Mark is flying the NAU flag also. Okay, so that's some places on Earth, but of course there's an even closer to home place on Earth where you might think that Earth looks a lot like places elsewhere in our solar system. This is Meteor Crater. If you haven't gone to Meteor Crater, please go to Meteor Crater. It's about a 45-minute drive that way. And it was the first first crater on Earth to be recognized as an impact crater. That was work done by Gene Shoemaker, who established this part of the USGS, the Astrogeology Science Center. And lots to say about Meteor Crater, but including the fact that astronauts have been training there since there have been astronauts. So this is a picture from the 1960s with the Apollo astronauts, and that's Gene Shoemaker right there. And he brought the astronauts to the crater because they were going to go to the moon, and they were going to see craters on the moon. And it's, well, let's learn about the craters on Earth before we see them somewhere else. So that's in the 1960s. This was about a year ago when the current astronaut corps came to Flagstaff and walked down into Meteor Crater, so they could also learn about what are craters like, so that before they go off to the moon or wherever they're going to go, they can have firsthand experience with the crater. We sent a group of 20 students there once a week, all last semester, in a course called AST 299, Impact Cratering. I think it's pretty cool that we're able to teach a class at Meteor Crater. NAU is the only university in the world that can teach a class at an impact crater. So I think it's pretty awesome. And we made them wear these reflective vests, and we look very official. Okay. One last thing about the moon. I already mentioned the astronauts were training here at the moon in the 1960s. You can see this is a picture from the Apollo era. There's the peaks right behind. And then, so I can't get my hand right here. Training astronauts for the moon then and also now. And I just want to mention Lauren Edgar, who's this person right here. She's a USGS staff scientist, and she is the astronaut geology trainer for the current astronaut group. So when the astronauts need to learn about geology, they show up here, and Lauren tells them everything they need to know. And then they go out into the field, they go out into the field and they use these crazy instruments, and they learn about how to do a field geology experiment so that when they're on the moon, they have some familiarity and some skills about looking at rocks, understanding which rocks might be interesting, how to make measurements, and so on. Okay, we're going to move on. Moving outward in the solar system, let's go to Mars. There's an awful lot to be said about Mars, including there's a Mars expert in the room sitting over there. But let me tell you about, there's some different ways to explore Mars. We can explore Mars with satellites, where we look at imagery, looking down on the surface, and you can make a map and a compositional map. You can send rovers to Mars. So this is a tiny little rover. It's like a microwave oven size that went to Mars in the 1990s. And this is Sojourner rover. This is Spirit and Opportunity to look like this. And this is the Curiosity rover. They weren't actually next to each other on Mars. This is just, these are the models that we have here on Earth. But they have all explored Mars. And then the one in the far right there is the Perseverance rover. And that's a selfie that it took of itself sitting on Mars. And then in the upper right, that thing is a little helicopter that was flying around on Mars about a year, maybe 2 years ago. It's only about this big. It looks like a mosquito. Actually, it's a tiny little thing flying around. But it was extraordinarily successful. First time that we've had another instrument flying around on another planet. And so we're already talking about what's the next. It's like a drone, you know, like a drone that you would fly in your backyard, whatever. What's the next one we're going to fly on Mars? Is it going to be more capable? Is it going to have a longer range, more instruments on board? And it helps us do some of the science on Mars, because instead of the rover driving from here to there, and then very slowly from there to there, you can fly this drone. You can go that way. You can go this way. You can go that way. Or you could say, well, let's scout out, where do we want to send the rover? What's the most interesting place? So that's some of the uses for the helicopter. It was underneath the chassis. It was deployed underneath, and then it had its own base. It never came back to the rover. Yeah. A couple more things about Mars. We do actually have a laser system operating on Mars, where the laser shoots out of the eyeball of this thing, and it blasts the rock, and it pulverizes or vaporizes the rock. And then you can measure the composition of the rock by seeing what comes out of that vapor plume. And Ryan Anderson here at the USGS is working on that, among many other people. And finally, I want to tell you about this thing over here. So in the last couple of years at NAU, we built a camera called VISIONS, which is the Visible Infrared Observation System, VISIONS. This is a student-built camera. We had about 35 students, mostly undergrads and a few grad students, who designed, built, tested, and commissioned this camera, and then delivered it to the NASA Escapade mission. So over here, this is Laura Lee, who was our lead student on this project. That's the camera. It's about this big. It fits in your hand. It weighs about 1 pound, and it's a few inches on a side. And this is a laboratory testing. Then it got mounted on the spacecraft. Then it got mounted on, there's 2 spacecraft, so it got mounted on both. That's what's shown here. And then we're headed for launch in early 2025, we think. We're ready. We have to wait for the rocket to get ready. Okay. Let's see, where am I going next? We're going to the asteroids next. I might have mentioned it's my favorite. And also, reminder that there are more asteroids in our solar system than anything else. Okay, so we're doing a lot of stuff in northern Arizona to learn about asteroids. One is related to NASA's DART mission, which happened several years ago. DART stands for the Double Asteroid Redirection Test. And this was a spacecraft that NASA built and launched and deliberately impacted or ran it into an asteroid in order to change the orbit of the asteroid. Why do you want to do that? Because someday there'll be an asteroid heading towards Earth that we might want to deflect, and we need to have practiced how are we going to do that. So we learned from this experiment how much energy you need to deflect an asteroid's orbit by such and such amount, and so that now we're more ready than we were before. So Christina Thomas at NAU was the telescope lead for this project, and among other things, they made these measurements here with the Hubble Space Telescope and the James Webb Space Telescope. And a lot of these funny stripes are actually artifacts from the image, but there is a big, boy, I have to go over here. There's a dust coming out of the asteroid this way and also this way that you can see in both of those images. And that is dust coming off of the asteroid after the impact. So we basically turned an asteroid into a comet briefly because it expelled all this material after we ran into it, on purpose, ran into it. Okay, I'll come back to that concept in just a minute. Let me also tell you in the lower right here, that's an asteroid called Bennu, where NASA sent yet a different mission that's called the OSIRIS-REx mission. Josh Emery at NAU was one of the team leads to understand the physical properties of that asteroid. That mission went to that asteroid. The last thing it did at the asteroid is it scooped up some rocks. Then it brought them back to the Earth. It dropped them in the desert. And then it kept flying. The mission did, not the rocks. Where's the mission going? It's now going to an asteroid called Apophis. And it'll rendezvous with Apophis in 2029, about 2 days after Apophis passes very close to the Earth. No chance of hitting the Earth, don't worry about that. But the same set of experiments that we did at this asteroid Bennu, we now can do at a different asteroid called Apophis right after it rendezvous with the Earth, or crosses paths with the Earth. And Chris Haberly from NAU is involved in that mission. And finally, this is a place where I spent a lot of time in my life. This is the summit of Mauna Kea in Hawaii on the Big Island. There's a lot of telescopes up there. And we use those telescopes to study remotely the compositions of asteroids. And the telescope on the right, that one, is called NASA's Infrared Telescope Facility. And it's a very venerable and well-used facility to study asteroids. Okay, well, a couple more things about asteroids. I mentioned that we had deliberately turned an asteroid into a comet briefly. It turns out there's lots of asteroids that turn into comets for reasons that we don't totally always understand. And so we're doing several projects to try to figure out how often that happens and why. So we're using data from this telescope, which is in Southern California. We gather a lot of data, so much data, in fact, that we never look at the images because there's too much data and you would spend your whole life looking through images and you'd never catch up. Instead, we have turned this into a computer science problem, and we're using this high performance computing with this guy, whose name is Chris Coffey, who is in charge of our high performance computing facility at NAU, used to work here at the USGS. And we're looking for asteroids that look like comets. And so Chad Trujillo and myself and Mike Gowanlock from computer science and Chris are all working on this together. And this, on the left side, I'm showing you a mosaic here. So these are all asteroid images, and a few of them, I hope you can see this, have little tails, and I've highlighted those in these pink boxes. So there's a tail going off to the right, tail going off to the right. This one has a tail going to the lower right. These are asteroids that occasionally look like comets. Not because we ran a spacecraft into them, but because something has happened in the universe to make them grow a tail, and then the tail disappears. And then it comes back, and then it disappears. And so we're working on understanding why it is that asteroids do that. Okay, I've been showing you these pictures. We've been in the inner solar system. We're going to now step into the outer solar system. We're going to talk about Jupiter. So Jupiter is the biggest planet in our solar system. This is a mosaic image, which is to scale, but not in the orientation that the Jupiter and satellites actually ever appear, but it's just to put them all on one slide here. And so Jupiter is these four large moons: Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. And I mentioned a long time ago that we had somebody who was working in Italy on a volcano this summer, and I said, well, there's volcanoes everywhere, other places in the solar system as well. So Io, Jupiter's moon Io, is the most volcanically active body in the solar system. There's volcanoes always erupting on Io. So maybe some of the things we're learning about volcanoes here on Earth, we can transfer that knowledge to learn about Io. But I don't want to talk about Io. I'm going to talk about Europa instead. That's this one here. Okay, so Europa is an icy moon of Jupiter. So the surface of Europa is a shell of water ice. And underneath that shell, we believe that there is a liquid water ocean. Okay, so I mentioned also before that on Earth we're studying places where life can live in extreme environments, and maybe there could be other places in the solar system where that could exist. This is what I was thinking about. On Europa, there's liquid water. There's an energy source actually also in Europa. There's no sunlight there, so your energy has to be somewhere not coming from like photosynthesis, but from something else. But there's energy, there's water, there's actually organic material there as well. Like, I don't know if there's life, but studying some of those extreme life communities on Earth may help us understand where could possibly exist on Europa. Okay, so NASA has a mission called the Europa Clipper mission, which launches in a couple weeks. I think it's October 14th or 12th or some day like that is their launch date. And Mike Bland here from the USGS is going to be out there for launch. He's working on that mission. It takes several years for the mission to get to Jupiter, so like don't hold your breath. But anyway, it's going to look something like this when it's orbiting Europa, and it's going to make these detailed measurements of both the surface and the interior of Europa. In the meantime, though, this guy is named Mark Luffler, and he works here at NEU, and he has this amazing astrochemistry lab where they do experiments that are studying materials that are like what we think Europa is made of. So it's water, ice, and then you add some organic material and maybe some other stuff, and then you put some irradiation on it because that's what Europa looks like as well. And then in the lab, you can measure how does that appear to our remote sensing instruments. Great. Now you compare that to the measurement you made with the telescope or a space mission or something else, and you say, oh, well, now I think I understand what the ground truth really is on Europa because I'm able to establish what it is in the lab and what it is with my measurements. So we're doing that now, not we, Mark is, in preparation for this mission that's going to be on its way pretty soon. Okay, I'm going to go to Saturn now. Saturn, of course, is the one with the beautiful rings. It has this incredible family of satellites that orbit, moons. And I'm just going to today talk about this one, Titan, which is over there in the pink box. Okay, so Titan is an icy moon of Saturn. And it is an amazing place. It has a hydrologic cycle that is analogous to what we have here on Earth, where water could be a liquid, it could be a solid, ice, snow, whatever, it could be a gas in the atmosphere. On Titan, there's also a hydrologic cycle, but it's not water. It's far too cold on Titan for water to be the material that is in all three states. Instead, it is a hydrocarbon soup. So methane, ethane, propane, and some other stuff like that. That can be gas, it can be liquid, and it can be solid on the surface of Titan. Also, Titan has a thick atmosphere. It actually has a thicker atmosphere than Earth does by a little bit. And so it has a lot of similarities to Earth, but also a lot of differences because it's far out in the solar system and quite cold. So it's an interesting place. We'd like to know more about how things work on Titan. So NASA has this mission called the Dragonfly mission, which is awesome. So this is going to land on the surface of Titan. It's going to make some measurements, and then it has these 4, or maybe it's 3, rotors. It's basically a helicopter or a drone or whatever else, and it's a nuclear-powered drone that's going to fly off and go somewhere else and then land and make some more measurements. So this thing's going to fly around on Titan for a couple years. It's going to spend a month here and make a measurements, and then fly over there and make some more measurements, and so on. We've never done anything like that. It's so cool. I'm really excited for this mission. It is launching in a couple years, and it's like 5 more years or more to get to Titan. So again, don't hold your breath, but it's going to be awesome when it gets there. But in the meantime, how could we learn about Titan? Well, this is a guy named Steve Tegler, who's a professor at NEU, and he also is working in a lab stuff here. And they're doing lab experiments to understand this hydrocarbon cycle, or the lakes that are on Titan. And there's other people, Garrick Lindbergh, who's from our chemistry department, and Jennifer Hanley and Will Grundy from Lowell Observatory. And they're doing all these experiments, and here's some results here. So what I'm showing is 3 pictures from an experimental setup. Each of these is looking at an experimental cell that's about maybe an inch or 2 across. Okay, so that's not to scale. These are just little cells, and inside it's very cold, and you put in the ingredients that we think or know are present on Titan. And then you can change compositions, you can change temperatures, and you can see what properties you end up with in your little experimental cell. So here's one where you have a liquid, and you have these beautiful ice crystals. Here's another one where there's ice on the bottom, ice here, gas here, and liquid here. So all 3 phases present right here in this little cell that's 2 inches across. Here's one that's only liquid at the bottom, and then ice in the middle, and then ice and gas at the top. So by understanding how those results change based on the slightly different climate or slightly different environmental properties, we can predict what's the behavior of this hydrologic cycle on Titan. Okay, next I've got Uranus and Neptune. I've paired them together. That should be your warning sign that I don't have very much to say about them. Uranus and Neptune are hard to study because they're very far away, bless you. And so we actually haven't had any new mission data on those planets since the Voyager mission in the late 80s, 1986 for Uranus and 1989 for Neptune. Maybe someday we'll have a new mission that goes there. I know that there's a lot of people advocating for that, but it's very expensive and it takes a long time because it's hard to get there. So it's a difficult thing to put together a mission that goes there. We can use telescopes to study those planets, but there's only so much you can do without actually being right there in front of them. So let me skip on and we'll go to Pluto, which, you know, on that original figure I showed you, it wasn't listed as a planet, but here in Flagstaff, Arizona, Pluto is always a planet and will always be a planet. Okay, so you probably have seen this picture. These are amazing images that came back from the New Horizons mission, NASA's New Horizons mission. This is the 2015 flyby of Pluto on the bottom and Charon on the top. You probably know that Pluto was discovered here in Flagstaff in 1930. You may also know that Charon, Pluto's largest moon, was also discovered here in Flagstaff in 1978. We didn't know anything about either of these bodies until we had the mission there. They were just basically dots of light in our telescopes. And now we see them as complex worlds that have colors. You can see there's lots of craters and lots of places with no craters, which is so bizarre. Charon has this giant fault across its equator and a red spot on the top. I mean, very complex worlds that we didn't know about. And I meant to mention that Will Grundy from Lowell Observatory has been a key player in this mission to the outer solar system. This is my favorite picture from the New Horizons mission. So this is Pluto. After the spacecraft flew by, it looked back at Pluto, and the sun is like in the background here. And so you can see all this amazing topography, and this is the region with no craters. But then my favorite part here is all of these layers in the atmosphere. So Pluto does have an atmosphere. If that atmosphere were here on Earth, we would call it a vacuum. It is so little amount of stuff that you wouldn't even notice it. You wouldn't call it an atmosphere. But look at all these layers in the atmosphere. There's tens or dozens and dozens of layers in this very tenuous atmosphere, layers of density, layers of composition that we never ever would have known about without having this mission. It's amazing. Okay, after the mission flew by the Pluto system, then a few years later encountered this thing called Arrokoth, which is a small body in the outer solar system. So for scale, here's Pluto. It's about 1,200 kilometers across diameter. This one, Arrokoth, is about 40 kilometers across. So this one here, Pluto, is telling us about how do big things in the outer solar system work. Craters, no craters, atmospheres, whatever. This one over here is telling us how do bodies in the outer solar system form. Because this one, in order to form big guys, you have to form small guys first. It's like playing with Legos. You take the little pieces, you put them together, you make a bigger thing, you make a bigger thing, a bigger thing. So a bunch of those had to stitch together to make one of these. And we do not understand how that process works. And of course, when we saw this, we were more confused after we saw it than before. Okay, one last thing in the outer solar system. We're also using telescopes to study the outer solar system. So this is a telescope in Chile that I've been using a lot. And we have these maps on the sky of where we point this telescope and we try to detect these very faint bodies in the outer solar system to understand this formation process. We also are using the James Webb Space Telescope and the Hubble Space Telescope together, and we're looking at this other map of the sky. We use the two telescopes together, which is awesome to have the two best telescopes ever built by humans, to use them at a common experiment in the outer solar system. So that's active research, results coming soon. Okay, so let me just wrap up here. I've told you some stories about how scientists in northern Arizona are international leaders. Well, you have to take my word for that, but it's true. In exploring the solar system, and we use all kinds of techniques. We're putting our feet on the ground in places on Earth. We're using laboratory experiments. We're using space missions, telescopes, and other tools to understand bodies throughout the solar system, and many exciting discoveries await. 2 announcements. That was the end of my talk, but here's my 2 announcements. Don't forget the Star Party, which is just right there and is happening now. So after you've had your fill in this room and picked up all your free stuff from the USGS, put on your warm hat and walk over. There are lots of amateur and professional astronomers and tons of very eager NAU students who can't wait to tell you about what you're looking at. And also, as Greg mentioned, there's a Festival of Science survey, which I'll put on the next slide. Thank you very much.